Hi, this is Bruce Gain with the New Stack. Thanks for joining us. The subject today is on-premise and cloud storage and how that ties in with data sovereignty. And I just wanted to ask, how many people in here have or work for an organization that has sensitive data on the cloud at this time? All right, interesting, okay. And how many have sensitive data only on-premise deployments? 50-50. Oh, 50-50, yeah. Okay, so I thought I would just ask the panel to introduce themselves, and then we'll get on our way and head right into our Q&A. Take it away, please.
All right, I'm Travis Jepson. I work for a company called Nav. We're based out of Salt Lake City, Utah in the US. And I'm the Senior Director of Engineering there. And I'm running the engineering crew for that company. Hey. Hey. You want to take that?
Yeah. Hey everybody, I'm Oren Penso. I'm a staff system engineer in VMware, focusing and specializing in cloud-native applications.
Hi guys, my name is Mark Korthaus. I'm the CEO and founder of Sys11, which is a managed hosting company which recently gone the container way. So I'm here to sing the on-prem song.
All right, good afternoon everyone. My name is Eric Lau. I work for NetApp here in Hamburg as a solutions engineer. Don't be confused, NetApp isn't developing any app. We are basically a storage vendor for hard and software solutions to store your data wherever you want, on, off-prem, that's up to you. And yeah, I'm happy to be here today.
Okay, so as far as data sovereignty goes and laws and regulations in different countries, I was wondering if each of you could describe what your experience is and how it should be, and at the same time, what is the status quo among your customers, for example, as far as deploying sensitive data on the cloud versus on-premise, and as far as the legalities or meeting the legal requirements in the different countries go?
Yeah, I'm starting? Yeah, please. All right, so I guess I'm starting with this one. For us, it really varies. Like it depends on what we're storing, who we're storing it for, and what the intent for that data is. And it really just kind of comes down to a per usage basis. And so a lot of times we end up working with our partners or whoever we're working with to store that data, and what their requirements are around that and what they need us to do for it. So with Nav specifically, like we're a US company. We're only in the US yet. We haven't been able to branch out internationally yet. We do have plans to in the near future, hopefully, but it really kind of ends up for us, like we work with credit bureaus and we work with financial institutions, and they are usually the ones that define for us what their expectations of their data storage is. And a lot of times we just have to live up to their expectations and recommendations.
Okay, so when he asked you guys if you are using the cloud for sensitive data, it was pretty much half and half, but from my experience in my customers, most of the traditional ones, the sectors of the financial and the public industry are still storing the data on-prem, and that's basically mostly around regulations and constraints that they still have. And if I can divide it, it's about 30-70. Most of the customers that I'm facing is still storing the data on-prem. And I think that most of them are in the first step or second step to understand how to do it, how to move the sensitive data, how to control it, how to do the data classification, how to manage the data either on-prem or off-prem.
So what I see is a trend that especially German companies, which I somehow represent for you guys over here, tend to use local providers because of GDPR and the German law enforcement around it. So what I see is a lot of companies doing historically using on-prem, are moving over to using companies like us or Lotsa or some other because they need to excel their IT, and they definitely need partners to hand out these sensitive data too. So question for them is, can we handle all these kind of applications on Kubernetes or on other infrastructure? And how can we excel on this? So, and I guess that's part of the tricky questions around regulations. For me, it's what you've already said is to be aware of the data is part of the regulation, and what data I'm storing of my customer. That's good that there's some regulation. I don't think the regulation is perfect. It's far from perfect, actually, I think. So for me, it's like we have these regulations. You need to, have a look at it and be conformed to it, and you need someone who helps you with that. And normally, these guys doing it legally doesn't help you that much. So you need partners to go to that very point.
Well, I would agree on your points. I also work mostly with customers here in Germany, and in particular, for example, in the public sector, clients are very reluctant to move their workloads to the cloud because they say, hey, our data is public, or it's from the general society, so we have to make sure that that it sticks around. In Germany, for example, some other clients say, well, we have a cloud-first strategy. We just would like to have any workload in the cloud, and it doesn't really matter if it's sensitive data or not. And personally, I think there's no real right or wrong. So you have to make certain risk assessments and say, okay, that are my critical applications. Maybe they should stick on premise. But given, let's say, the demographical changes we are facing at some point, I think some companies have to move their workloads into the cloud because they can't handle the work by themselves anymore. And I think that's going to be pretty difficult in the future to make sure that there are no data breaches, for example, because once the data is up there, yeah, you face certain risks you don't have on-premise.
And I was curious about when you're speaking with your customers, how much is tied when they're making the decision to deploy to the cloud, how much is their decision based on cost versus the security aspect? Or when they decide to go on-premise, for example, how does that factor in, or just both?
Okay, I answer first on this. For us, it's nearly every customer asks about it, and it's his first question. So
They ask about how much it costs, or
no, it's where it's located. So where are your data centers? Is it your data centers? Are you DSGVO conform, which doesn't mean which mean GDPR conform? So that's one of the very first questions. And what I see is there's a lot of people are unsure if they can move to the cloud without any help of this kind. So yes.
Maybe I can extend on that. What I noticed while talking to clients, that they are sometimes not just aware when some workloads have been moved already to the cloud. So you have, for example, the central IT, and they take care of all the on-premise environment and infrastructure, and it's fine. But then you have, for example, the marketing department with some developers, and they just go to the cloud because they say, I only need to swipe the credit card at AWS, and I get my Lambda functions, for example, which the IT department simply doesn't offer. And then it's getting pretty difficult because sensitive data might leak out of the company, and there, I think, is where the risk lays.
I do see customers that divide the layers, so they do like the front end in the cloud for resiliency and for cost, and for just be able to scale out when they need, but the data locality and the data, the layers for the data is still on-prem. So, and that's the security aspect. So it's cost and security.
For us, so with our customers, is usually like us, we're the ones that are storing the data, and so a lot of times we don't. So being like the customer in and of ourselves, the question a lot of times for us just kind of comes down to whether or not we understand what the requirements are. And so like listening to this group, you know, it sounds like this is a question that a lot of us have as to what regulations do I have to follow specifically for my data, and if I want to be able to store particular things in the cloud in order to provide flexibility and scalability, like what does that mean for me? And when we started approaching the cloud and started approaching containers, I was told at the beginning that it would be an impossibility to move into containers because of security reasons. And what we ended up doing is just understanding our own regulations and understanding the security concerns and also the compliance concerns that we had surrounding our data. And then we explained to like our governing bodies how we were meeting their requirements, but not necessarily in the way that they were used to. You know, like where we moved from bare metal machines to virtual machines into containers, like the world constantly evolves. And so for us, it came down to really just understanding what our regulations were and what things we had to follow, and then helping them understand how we were meeting them.
I would do a quick poll for you guys. Who of you uses Kubernetes Federation to some extent? So does someone use Federation of Kubernetes from you guys? So okay, so nobody for now. Bastian, at least you should. But anyhow, so what I really think is that there's an opportunity within Kubernetes which really can solve this issue. And first of all, it's about how containers work. So they're completely portable. So you can use your cloud, you can choose freely your cloud. And that's what Kubernetes and Google recently announced is you can use Federation within Kubernetes to deploy wherever you want to see your workload running. So what you can do is, and that's a very fancy feature, which for now nobody really proposes. But that's because all these hyperscalers are the all-in cloud. So one player keeps it all. So what happens is, if you have like a managed hosting environment based on Kubernetes, you can use Federation to deploy your containers on different clouds. So you can choose actually where to put your GDPR compliant workload and where to roll out internationally, like on AWS or Azure or your favorite cloud provider, where to roll out your front end, for instance. So, and I guess that's a feature nobody really knows about, and I'm missing the talks about Federation because that's the coolest shit ever available since Kubernetes, from my point of view. So look out for cloud providers which really allows you to use Kubernetes to propagate wherever you want to your containers to some different clouds. And I guess that's a really fancy feature nobody talks about.
I have to admit, it's the first time I've heard mention of it.
So I actually have a comment on that too. So we, like it in a little lower level than that, within our Kubernetes clusters in and of themselves, we had to create like a logical separation of the machines that our workloads were running on. And we were using taints and tolerances, which is another thing that within Kubernetes a lot of people don't seem to really talk about. But with running secure workloads, we definitely didn't want those to run with like our front-facing web servers. And so creating that logical separation within the cluster and then being able to have clusters located in particular areas depending on what you're doing. You know, Kubernetes really helps create a system to where you can leverage the pieces of the cloud that you want to, whether those become on-premise or in the cloud.
I also would agree on that it makes it very flexible to say, okay, I don't want to be logged into one cloud vendor, for example, for specific use cases. But I also would say that it's pretty important to know what kind of data you actually have. And that's very difficult to figure out because a lot of companies just source the data or the data is available and there's no real governance to say, okay, that's the data which has been created by that person, it's owned by this one, it can be changed by that many persons. So if you really would like to be compliant and have this data sovereignty, it's important that the technology layer with Kubernetes, for example, is set up appropriately, but also that you're aware of your data on its own.
At the same time, Eric, you mentioned the rogue executive or employee who's going to, just to save time, might deploy sensitive data to a jurisdiction or an area where he or she should not, for example. How do you manage that?
So when you're talking about shadow IT, I think it's pretty difficult to manage and to prevent. And the only way you could prevent it is that you have a super secure environment. But when you have that, it's very difficult to, stay efficient because you have to make sure that certain regulations and controls are still met. So it's always a balance between, let's say, enough freedom for the developers, but also security to avoid the shadow ITs. And I think, again, there's not really there's no silver bullet, let's put it that way, to implement for big enterprises in particular.
So with that, it ends up being something that you constantly have to be paying attention to. Like, we really try to work with our developers to help them understand like what they can and can't do. But a lot of the times, like, they'll end up doing things because it's easier for them, and sometimes there's things that we find out about after the fact, which can cause a lot of problems depending on what exactly they're doing. But one thing is, so we've started implementing a lot of processes around being able to launch into a production cluster to have something production ready and available, to start giving like a questionnaire to our developers to help them start like asking themselves, okay, what kind of data do I have? Do I know how to answer that question? And do I understand the risks associated with treating this data in a particular way? And so for us, it kind of just came down to a questionnaire that we hand out and have them assess themselves and what they're doing.
Or for a company such as VMware, do you have any thoughts about that, or can you talk about that?
About
the subject about the rogue employee or the quote shadow IT.
So that you can see it in every industry, in every customer. You can see the shadow IT is just blooming. And actually, around the data locality or the data or the multi-cloud, I'm thinking about the next step and trying to make like stateful Kubernetes, stateful containers on Kubernetes, and using persistent volumes, and there's a difference between on-prem and off-prem, and how do you manage the data inside like the persistent volumes, and how do you manage the volumes themselves? So I think it's a challenge. It's if it's a challenge right now, it's going to be a huge challenge afterwards in the next steps. I wanted to ask the crowd, like if they're using any stateful containers in cloud or on-prem and with sensitive data? Someone? No?
One. A few, yeah.
Like on-prem? Yeah, okay.
So what I see regarding shadow IT, how you call it, which is a nice word for it. I never heard of it, but I like it. We don't do shadow IT, no. But anyhow, so what I see is we have some customers which are not the IT department of companies, but the marketing divisions. So, and that's somehow a different level, because somehow they're collecting marketing data, and there's never some IT guy involved which at least scans through what data is collected and how it's processed. So what I see is it would be really helpful to have a standard documentation way or process way like we have ITIL on the other side. So on how data moves through an application, who's concerned, who's responsible and accountable for some regulations on part of it. And I guess if there's somehow a documented toolkit developers can use, so there are not, the only ones who are in charge for data regulations on one side, because they somehow need to handle the IT machinery on the other side. So, and I guess that's one part of where I see tools missing and processes missing, which really could help to solve these issues.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah, what kind of tools? I mean, you mentioned federated Kubernetes. That sounds fascinating. Any other tools you can think of?
I think there's a lot, and I think it kind of just depends. Like for us, one thing is like when you're storing the data in a particular state means that it is either more at risk or not at risk, right? Like so what we try to do is try to mitigate that risk as much as possible by kind of like doubling or tripling up on encryption in different ways. And so like not only do we store our data at rest encrypted, but with sensitive data, we have a system. Well, so we use HashiCorp Vault to do their transit encryption, and so the system has to be authenticated in order to actually read that data. So even if you have data inside the database, per column or per whatever that data ends up being, it ends up being encrypted so that a particular service can only access it. And so so in that sense, like as that data travels through the network or wherever it ends up going, it's encrypted to the point that nothing can actually read it until it gets to the service that has the authorization to do so. And so by figuring out how to mitigate your risk as much as possible, the data is most valid when it's in a raw form. And so trying to figure out how to prevent yourself from having that raw form available as much as possible, you kind of help push a lot of those regulations away from that data.
So if we're talking about tools, so we have like in VMware, part of our stack is storage policy-based management, so you can encrypt the data on rest on transit. And if you're using the same stack in cloud, so you can do like a hybrid cloud with the on-premise stack of VMware and on-cloud VMware, and then the storage policy-based management is just going with the data itself, with the volume itself, so you can encrypt the data wherever it is. But again, it's hybrid cloud in a specific solution. It's not like the public. So
the hybrid cloud solutions, at the same time, the customer can actually trace or follow where the...
Yeah, in our hybrid cloud, it's the same stack, it's the same technology, it's the same look and feel and the same means and the same policy that goes with the data or with the VM itself. So,
no, but they can actually trace where the data is physically located and stored.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, maybe one thing I would like to say concerning encryption, I think it's a valid approach to do that, though. I mean, as with any kind of encryption, it's pretty difficult with the key management. So you have to make sure that the keys are also secured properly, because the one who's going to get access to the keys has also access to the data, and then no encryption on this planet is secure enough in a way. And I also would like maybe to extend your point. At NetApp, we also follow the same approach. So we offer our clients a hybrid cloud model. So if you would like to store your data on-prem and off-prem, we have the interface and the solution to exchange the data in an efficient manner, so that that you can federate, for example, your Kubernetes cluster or your block storage wherever you like to, depending on the need and requirements. But again, that doesn't mean you're necessarily compliant. And one thing I would like to add is, the funny thing is when people move to a hyperscaler, they are most of the time more secure because they have all the regulations and the compliance in their pocket compared to the local IT departments, because it's very demanding, to keep that operation ongoing and stay compliant at the same time.
And for those who are here who have not deployed to the cloud, I was wondering, is it possible to just describe succinctly where do the legal liabilities stop once you port to the cloud? I mean, is that possible to define that and describe that, or will we be here all night to discuss that?
Well, basically, the cloud provider provides the product, and the customer is responsible for the data. And most of the times, I mean, depending on the model, if it's like SaaS, PaaS, or IaaS, for example, but most hyperscalers I'm aware of, they say, here's the solution, here's the compute, here's the storage, what you put in there.
Yeah, but it's a little bit of the good luck approach, So these are the products, and you have these fancy features like encryption at rest, but actually it doesn't really help. It just helps on the paper for the checkbox. But it doesn't help in the reality, because nobody breaks into a data center and removes hard disks and go and ask the NSA to help to decrypt this data. So I guess a lot of these features are really like nice, but it's not, it's just because the legal enforcement around it enforces you to do it. What I see is, how do you handle your data within your application? And there's nearly no guideline for all these developers around these days. So for me, question is, how do you handle it? Do you have some advisors helping you? How do you get there? So, and I guess there's with Kubernetes, we, for the very first time, have the opportunity to run workloads on multi-cloud environments. And the question is, and then we are at the point you discussed, because it's possible to deploy wherever you need to and you want to. So you need to handle the data, and you can choose if you need these checkbox with encryption, rest, and stuff, whatever is necessary for your data, or you mean which is necessary. But we are with Kubernetes, you can deploy it everywhere, so the data stays within your pods, within whatever you've deployed. And with the multi-cloud approach, we are, for the very first time, at a point where you don't need to go to one hyperscaler and run all your workloads there and deploy on all their necessary tools, which is the unlimited lock-in you can avoid. And I guess that's the fancy stuff around Kubernetes. And that's why everybody loves it somehow. But what I see is nearly nobody uses Kubernetes to use it in a multi-cloud environment, as far as I know, because that's what I asked for, Federation. So from the data point and the legally binding GDPR compliance stuff, so I guess that's a new time we are entering, where you can run your workload in a multi-cloud environment, and that's brand new. So we never got this. We got all these infrastructure as a service companies like AWS, Azure, and they are all throwing money at you if you start up a company. But that's because they are all in. So, and Kubernetes is the very first moment in the new IT era where you can use your data wherever you want to. And that's, I'm pretty impressed about it. And that's why we support it so much, because it's somehow a freedom of choice again. And so we had that for quite some time, and these guys working hard to provide you with these services. But yeah, I guess that's very fancy. You should use it.
I think that unfortunately, if the regulations and the regulators in different countries are not in the point to enable like the transfer of sensitive data, and there's a lot of countries that it's not supported yet, it's not allowed yet. I think the next step that you are mentioning, and it's really exciting, and it's a great place to be in. It's far away. You know what I'm saying? If it's far away from...
Oh yes.
Yeah, so if it's far away right now with the data locality, it's even more far away with Kubernetes and multi-cloud.
Would you run any kind of application with Kubernetes? Or where would you make the boundary to say, hey, this should be on a classical VM environment or on a bare metal environment? Where do you draw the line?
Good question. I have, for nearly 2 years, I was talking about, don't you run, like you asked, right? Don't you run any databases or stateful services within Kubernetes? But that seems to change. So there are tools available. Kubernetes with each release gets much better in deploying like MySQL databases and all these kind of stuff. So it doesn't depend any longer on you only run your application service on Kubernetes. And while this changes and Federation comes in, we have the opportunity to really run the full stack with all these services on top within Kubernetes. I guess there's room for improvement in terms of tools, however you name it, but we have some companies here doing great stuff around it. And I guess that's what makes it affordable again, because you can keep pace with what in the industry is happening. And you don't need these hyperscalers anymore. And if you need them, you use them just for a certain kind of workload you would like to being provided with. So.
So running SAP on Kubernetes in the cloud is no problem at all, in your opinion?
I would say SAP is an extreme example of what you would run. But I guess let's go 3 more years into the future, and I guess it's no problem then. So and what I see is there's much more companies adding features and whatever's needed to run their applications on Kubernetes. And I guess it's not stoppable, so it just will happen. And with what Google recently announced is that all these kind of providers of applications like Redis or these databases get refunded by letting their applications run on Kubernetes and on all of their stuff. So that's a very clever model Google just recently announced. So I'm very optimistic you can run in like 5 years nearly all workload on it. And maybe the companies need to change how they work internally with their software. But I guess we are in the run of it.
I think there's going to be more workloads on Kubernetes, and I think moving forward, as you said, there's going to be more use cases and more applications. But eventually, mainframe hasn't died, you know. So VMs or virtual machine won't die, and it's another layer. So we will have everything, and that's the challenge: securing multiple hybrid environment with physical and virtual and containers. And it's not just the data; it's everything. It's like securing and maintaining those environments.
So, in my perspective, I think that I had a thought and then I was starting to go away. But like as far as the legality behind what your data is doing, like I agree. I think that in a point, you know, where we're going, you see technology getting to a point to where we haven't run into these issues legally before as far as like a sovereignty or a legal issue has been concerned, because it hasn't been something we've really been able to do. Like cloud computing per se is still a pretty new thing, and we're seeing the fact that legislation, the regulations around that are trying to catch up and trying to figure out what that really means for us. And I think that right now we're kind of in a state of flux where we don't fully know. And we have all this technology, we can do all these things, we can run workloads across the entire world. But what does that mean from a regulation standpoint? What does that mean from a data protection standpoint? What does that mean from like our users and where their information is stored and what right they have over that? And the regulations just haven't caught up to this. And there is really a difficult, we're at a kind of a really difficult influx point. Now, as far as like what I feel like the data provider or the cloud providers is how much they want to get involved in this. Like they don't really want to know what you're running, and they don't really want to get involved in it. And they're providing the technology for us to be able to move quickly. But at the same time, like it's our responsibility to really understand what we're doing with our data and how best to protect it. And I think if you take a metaphor of like you go and buy a car, and the car manufacturer, they're going to do everything they can do to prove to you that this car is the safest car for you to drive around. Now, at the same time, like you may inadvertently get in an accident or run into something or cause damage to yourself or people in the car or someone else or property. Now, the car manufacturer is not going to get involved with that because they did what they needed to do to provide the security for you, but it's up to you on how you operate that. And I think within a cloud providing or cloud on-premise hybrid, however it is, like it's the same thing. Like it ends up becoming your responsibility on how you control the data and the things flowing in and out.
I think we can agree that nobody is entirely satisfied with the status quo of data sovereignty in any country. But just in a few sentences, how should it be? How should data sovereignty be governed in the respective countries? I mean, is there just a few ideas?
I think he referred it in the right way. Like we lack the tools and the methodology to basically get a common ground around data all over the places, not with difference between countries and vectors or sectors. And I think that's the baseline. You know, we need something to get from, and we don't have it right now.
I absolutely agree. I think that creating that common ground and the ability for us to call, basically, come to a consensus of what does this mean across the entire world is really the best way to be able to solve it.
I think that something like GDPR is something very valuable, which has been applied just pretty recently, but it's the first move in the right direction to protect sensitive personal data. I know it might be really annoying for some of you, but it's a first step in the right direction, in my opinion. And I think that legislation should empower innovation and and make sure that companies aren't getting blocked because of that, which is pretty difficult to apply, obviously. But to achieve a common ground, one step in the right direction is to govern your data appropriately so you know where it resides.
So you all agree that the GDPR is a step in the right direction?
So what I was going to say is that after GDPR, there is a similar law in the works in California right now in the States, which will create an enforcement of the same sort within the United States. And I think that being able to have some regulations in some countries being strong enough or willing enough to be able to say, hey, maybe we do need to step in and to help everyone else figure out what makes sense. We need to represent our citizens and what rights they have with where their data is and how companies are treating their data. And when things like that happen, other nations start to catch on and start to see that and seem to follow suit. And I think the GDPR is a good example of that.
Yeah, I'm exactly the same. I think the GDPR is a first common ground, but it's supposed to be globally, not just for Europe and not just for a specific sector or something like that.
I guess we have certain problems within the actual rule set of GDPR, but the mindset is good because who owns the data? You do it. So, and I guess that's the right approach. What I see is it's not written very good. It's not really, I have the very impression that a lot of guys really do not knew what to write about. So they really do not understand IT. And at some point of these regulations, you realize, okay, they didn't know either. So, and that's what I think GDPR is a good start, but it's just a start. So, yeah.
Okay, thank you. I thought we'd take some questions from the audience. Someone right here. There you go. Thank you.
Yeah, I think one ingredient is missing: trust from the customer to the cloud provider. So this has not been discussed because is he trustworthy to have all my data?
So we had a discussion around trust earlier, and I guess eventually you need to trust someone. And yeah, if you are choosing a cloud provider to to do everything for you, and you are putting the application and the mission critical application in their hands, so yeah, you are also putting your data in their hands. So if you're getting a common ground with them, and the regulations allow you to handshake the cloud provider and do it, like the accountability will be together, or the accountability is yours, but he will have this certain criteria to get the data that you are transferring to him. Yeah, I guess it's some trust is the most valuable thing here. So,
but I don't agree because there need to be a regulation with really some problems if you don't get accounted for it. Because if you hop into your customers' machines and look whatever data is in there, handshake is a very nice opportunity. So,
no,
so trust ends over there.
Yeah,
so.
no, that's okay. I meant that in the agreement with the cloud provider, of course, you are taking care of every details and those things. But again, you are trusting him. So
I also would like to add something on that. I think trust is crucial when you move your workloads to the cloud. But I don't want to be too critical here, but how can you trust your local IT department on the same level? You know, on the one hand, you have like a cloud provider with specialists taking care of that 24 hours, 7 days a week, all the whole year, compared to an enterprise with an IT department with also trained people, but maybe not that specialized. So, yeah, where do you draw the line? I think that's very difficult, and I think you can establish trust with, for example, certain audits from independent parties, but at the end, it's up to you to trust them or not.
Okay.
I guess we are the ones standing between the beer and the sweat.
Any other questions before we go have a beer or whatever you'd like to drink? Any more questions? No? We're all good. Thank you very much for joining us. I hope you enjoyed this as much as I did, and have a good rest of the night.